Lammy, we agreed to talk about this game, Inscryption, and what a game it is. I played it. I did not finish it. I only got through Act 1, but please don't let that stop our conversation. I've looked into the spoilers. I know the spoilers, so we can talk about them. But what we might do is say the first half of our conversation might be spoiler-free about Inscryption, and when we're ready to move on, we'll just say so that we're going to go into spoiler territory. And then we might start talking about the broader picture about board games and how a live tabletop game might be different from a video game, or in some ways the same, from a design perspective, but also from a player perspective. Before we talk about all of that, though, going back to Inscryption, when I looked into this game, everyone celebrates this as a successful indie game released in 2021. Indie is the word that's placed on almost every single review or discussion about this game. It makes sense. I mean, it was developed by one guy at a game jam who in, I think, 2018, who then later developed it into something bigger. But really, it's one guy as a developer who's bringing other people into his team. Makes sense that would be indie compared to like a AAA. But there's a big gap between those two things. So for you, what is an indie game, and why are they seeming to have such a resurgence?
Um, I don't know like the official definition of indie. I mean, I know that you're essentially independent from like a big, I guess, publishing company. Uh, I would guess. Like, I'm trying to think of what, because I'm thinking, is it the publisher that would make a gaming company indie? Because I know there's sort of smaller indie dev companies, and then there's smaller indie sort of publishers, but I don't know if that's actually considered independent or not. But I really usually just think of it as it's a smaller company. It's a smaller group of people. It could still be a group. They just don't have as big of a funding. They're not a big sort of dev shop that just prints money and games. And that to me is what indie usually means. It usually just means it's going to be either a small-ish company or one that doesn't have a lot of money. Like, I'm trying to think of what I wouldn't know. Take something like CD Projekt Red, who developed the Witcher games and Cyberpunk. Are they indie? Were they indie before? Are they not indie anymore? I don't really know. I mean, usually it is a real definition that exists.
Yeah, and I think the trouble with this definition of indie is a lot of companies are co-opting it when they don't really deserve the title, and then a lot of companies move past it. CD Projekt Red is not an indie company. They can't possibly be anymore, but they obviously once were. And yet sometimes people say and label them with this word indie, and there's even PR agencies that are working with indie companies now. And it's almost like organic used to be for food. No one really knew what it meant, so everyone just said that they were organic, and then it came time for standards to come in. But the second question was, why do you think people want to play indie games? Is it the sense that I'm doing something good by supporting a smaller team, or are indie companies offering something different, something edgy, something that the bigger ones just aren't giving us?
Yeah, I do think it's that they're offering something different. And if I had to, psychoanalyze why that might be, I think the bigger the company, just like any corporation, the harder it is to go against status quo. And if you're a really, really big developer that had particular games that made you a lot of money, and especially if those are the kinds of games you release lots of sequels to, or you take something like, the all the sports games, right? The basketball games, the NBA games, the NHL games that they just release a new one every year. It's just a thing that they do now, right? Like, I don't know if any year the game is really all that different from the years before. They just add in a few new things and it's expected. And that's kind of what you expect out of the bigger companies. Essentially, they've done something that's been successful, that's made them big. And I think there's probably a feeling like we can't stop doing that thing because that's why people pay us money. So let's just keep doing the same thing until people stop paying us money. Whereas an indie developer isn't making any money. No one's paying them. So they get to do whatever they're maybe passionate about. And sometimes you get a really big hit. Sometimes that really resonates with an audience where they're just getting to try totally new kinds of games that I think the bigger AAA companies, the games feel very same-y, right? If there were things that made me think of a AAA game, I would say it's hyper-realistic visuals usually. They're not very aesthetically interesting. They're usually trying for realism because they have the money to try for realism. So you don't get a lot of, interesting art. Like, it might be beautiful, but it's often usually not with a particular art direction that oftentimes for indie companies comes out of needing to save money. They do a 2D style or a retro style or a painted style because it's easier than doing, beautifully rendered 3D models of, hyper realism. But it also means that a lot of AAA games start looking the same. Then a lot of them are kind of open world with, some sort of RPG story elements. They start to all feel very samey. And I think what people get from indie companies, besides supporting the little guy, which I think people do want to do, I think you do honestly get just interesting new ideas. And maybe they're shorter and smaller in scope, but sometimes they're not. Hollow Knight, another lovely game, is one that's a indie $15 game, but you could spend hundreds of hours in that game. In fact, even the core storyline is probably at least 50 hours. So, not a small game, not a $15 type price point.
Yeah, Hollow Knight just continues to appear on every list I see of like the top 10, top 50 games. I keep seeing Hollow Knight. I actually own it, have never booted it up. I know you want me to play, and maybe we'll talk about it at some point. Once we talk about Outer Wilds, I think we can have that as the first milestone. Inscryption, obviously, is one of these games which offers something very interesting on multiple levels. It reminded me a lot of Doki Doki Literature Club. I can't imagine, in fact, that there wasn't some direct influence there, that Daniel Mullins, the developer of Inscryption, didn't play and think about Doki Doki. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's 100 different other influences that are similar to Doki Doki, and my understanding of games is so limited that it has to be that one. But there are similarities, and there's the somewhat of the horror element, although this game, the horror is part of it, but it's not the dominant part. It's almost a false horror. It's almost like you're in a situation where you would be scared, but as the player, you don't have to be. Whereas in Doki Doki, I think it flirts with, no, you're going to be scared. This is a potentially horrifying moment. What drew you in about Inscryption? What was the thing that made you want to play this game and want to talk about this game?
Well, like many things, what drew me into this game and what made me find out about it is watching other people first play it. And I'll have to give another shout out to, the streamer and YouTuber who got me into any of this world of watching video games and into roguelites in the first place, which is Northern Lion. Love his content, and he was playing Inscryption. And I think I watched maybe one video and I went, oh, I can't watch this because I need to play this. And sometimes I'll watch, games that he plays, and like actually he's the reason I played Slay the Spire as well. He and I think he named it like his favorite game of 2019, which, considering that it's such a small game, that was a pretty big deal. That one, for example, I could watch and not feel spoiled because it was a very mechanically driven game, so I didn't really feel like I, had issues watching somebody else. It's kind of like watching somebody play Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone. You're not really feeling like it affects your gameplay too much. I mean, they might give you ideas you wouldn't have had, but it's not really spoiling the experience. But with Inscryption, I think I watched a little bit of it. I saw that it was a deck builder kind of deck game, and already I was intrigued, having liked Slay the Spire. And I just went, yeah, I have to play that. Stop watching this video right now. Went and got it. And, the hook that it has is, I think, very strong. It's very charismatic. Like, I would say it's a highly charismatic game in both you mentioned the horror elements, but it's almost cutesy. It almost flirts with this, like, isn't this quirky? Like, isn't this? And I really appreciate that. There's like a level of humor and satire around everything it's talking about that is just very, very delicious. And I will say I've also not played all the way through, so we'll see. You probably know more than I do. I still haven't finished it. I think I'm in Act 2. We've played through some of Act 2, but I haven't gotten to all of it yet. So we'll see how much we can talk about. It's just the kind of game that you didn't need to see much of, I think, to think, like, even if I had only seen 5 minutes and it was just the deck building and the playing, for me, that was already interesting and fun enough from the way it presented the gameplay and just the feel of it. maybe you can talk a little bit about just when you first open it up and just playing and the way that it feels and comparing that to Slay the Spire, because it is interesting. We talked about how good Slay the Spire feels to play, but I would say Inscryption takes that even a bit further to really putting you like you're playing the card game.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just said that I want to address. I mean, first of all, the idea of a card game. So in Act One, there's three acts to Inscryption. Act One, I
Should
think
we give a spoiler warning? Are we there yet?
I guess that's already a spoiler to say there's more than one act. It doesn't communicate that to you right at the beginning. So I guess we're going to spoil mild spoilers here. There is a shift between Act One, Act Two, and Act Three. There's actually a mod out there released by the developer called Casey's Mod, which allows you to play Act 1 endlessly because so many people love the mechanics of it. And I think that's an interesting marriage that this game is able to achieve between making it really interesting and fun to play with the mechanics, but at the same time telling an interesting story, making you think about this, and then turning your expectations on their head, and surprising you at times. Not in a horror way, but maybe sometimes in an existential sort of way. You mentioned how card-like it is to play this game, or how I guess I don't know if you said tactile, but it's such an interesting game to almost feel. And one thing that I noticed with this is the sound design almost is like touching these cards and feeling myself in this room, in this cabin, which I'm trapped in at the beginning. So when you open it up, the first thing that you notice is you can't play a new game. You have to continue. And you just show up in this cabin, and there's a guy across the table. You can't see his face, or man or woman, actually. And you don't know why you're there, and all you know is that this person across the table really wants you to play cards with him. And eventually you discover he really doesn't like to lose these card games, which is really interesting because there are moments in this game where your opponent at this card table in a cabin cheats. And does things you don't expect. And so it is a roguelike game in the sense that you can die. And when you die, interesting things happen, and you restart, and you go back into the story. But just to go back to that sense of cards, because this is partly why we're talking about this game, there's something about this game that feels like playing cards in a room, which is something that no video game can do for me. So I like playing cards. It's a family tradition. I love sitting around a table for hours and hours and hours, playing really quite simple games with basic rules. And yet there's an interesting social glue that occurs when we do this. And I could go for hours and really not say all that much. I'm not engaged in fascinating conversation. I'm just focusing on my hand, but I feel like I'm achieving something with other people. And there's a sense to that. And it's also one more thing about this. The card game in Inscryption is pretty straightforward. There are 4 rows of 4 cards. You've got 2 rows of 4, and your opponent has 2 rows of 4, but only one of those rows is active, is doing anything. And you've got a very limited number of cards in your hand, and you've got decks you can pull from. At the start, there's not a lot you feel you can do, and yet you still can achieve quite a bit at the beginning. Anyways, so you enjoyed the card aspect, the deck building aspect of this game, hey?
I did enjoy it. I do think it's not super deep in what was there because they do want you to progress, like you said, more with the story and the game. And I almost wonder if the developer purposely made it slightly, easy and kind of, okay, we're not going to do this forever, to sort of prompt people to explore other aspects of the game. Because obviously, I mean, could have been slightly more complicated. The actual basis, I think, of the game could have a fair amount of depth, even though it's simple to set up. But the fact that when you're actively playing it, your opponent, as you say, behaves in particular ways that are really, really easy to predict once you've played through a few of the loops. So I think that makes it less deep in that way, but it forced me to be like, okay, let's get a move on. Even though I was trying to be really cute with it, and I wanted to be really, really efficient every time I played to kind of play it perfectly. And you sort of learn that it's not that important in this for the whole of Inscryption to kind of play perfectly. You just need to play well enough to continue. And yeah, I did enjoy it.
I think it's quite forgiving, even though it doesn't let you in on that secret right away. It doesn't take. Apparently, this game can be finished in about 9 to 10 hours total, the whole game. And in the beginning, I was surprised by how much I was screwing up and not even knowing what I was doing, and yet I was still succeeding in a combat and moving on to the next place, and moving on to the next place. And like, I remember I was in a boss battle, and I thought, okay, I don't even know what these cards do. He's got special abilities, and I won, and I couldn't believe it. And I think it's forgiving, but the atmosphere is unforgiving. When you die, there's something threatening that happens, and then you come back. The cards also, some of them talk to you, which actually is an important part of the plot. You can also explore the room. So I think you're right about this, that the developer clearly thought, okay, we can't let people get trapped into this and get bored by learning this card game. Maybe it was that he wasn't confident in the card game, but maybe he just wanted to propel the player to go forward. And that doesn't take too long to get to that point. But you kind of feel cheated because you want to go back to playing the cards and you want to master it because there's so much of the deck building yet to do. And you and I, perfectionists that we've talked about so many times we want to go and there's a card that I never really got to master, or several cards I never really got to play, or synergies that I wasn't able to explore, which of course Slay the Spire is all about that. Like, yeah, you're going to get to play again, and you're going to play for 980 hours or whatever it is to explore all of the different possible synergies, and you'll still have more to go. Yet in this game, there was a sense of propulsion, of moving forward into the next thing, which was rewarding. There's one other really interesting thing that is immediately clear in this game, which is sacrifice, that you have to make a sacrifice in order to succeed. How did you feel about that?
Oh man, I mean, you can maybe guess that I wasn't a fan.
Yep, I can.
Yeah, of course it irks. Like, oh, what do you mean? No, I want to keep all my cards. I don't want to have to sacrifice anyone.
My first thought was, okay, so that card requires a sacrifice. Okay, I'll wait for a card that doesn't. Those are just I got way too many sacrifice cards at the beginning here. There isn't. It's all about sacrifice. And in fact, the theme of Daniel Mullins' game dev project was sacrifice. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, it was very funny, but I think this game allowed me to kind of flip some of those switches and just accept, like I said, I wanted to play a particular way, and then I'm like, okay, but that's not what the game is about. This game is about something else. Let's explore that. Let's explore what the developer is actually trying to tell us here. And I think that's actually when I turned off the video where I was watching Inscryption, is the moment when you're told, hey, stand up. Because there is this moment, so some more spoilers ahead for the first act. But when you first start, you're just playing a deck builder, as far as you know, right? Oh, it's a bit weird that some of the cards talk to you. Maybe that's just the cute little quirk of this game, is that some of the cards talk to you. And then your opponent says, hey, get up and go get me something. And all of a sudden, like, in a weird, it's almost not even the fourth wall that's broken. It's like another wall that's broken between the player's expectation and what world you're thrust into. It's almost like you went from, I mean, literally, like you're going from 2D to 3D. You're being told everything you were looking at and the way you experience the game. Now you're told, stand up, and you go, what? And all of a sudden you realize, okay, this is a very different kind of game. And that was when I think I turned off the video and I went, oh, I need to play that. Like, when I had just seen the cards, I'm like, oh, this looks kind of cool. Like, maybe I'll like the mechanics. Well, we'll see. And as soon as the opponent says, stand up and grab me something from over there, and you notice, oh, I'm in a locked cabin. And, oh, that's the goal of the game. It's not just to beat, him, but I need to get out of here. The motivations that it gives you and how it treats. The reason I really wanted to talk about this game when you first brought up, let's talk about board games and like tabletop games and all of that, is because it is mimicking a tabletop game. I mean, a card game, but it's like a tabletop game within a card game in a way, because there's the RPG elements of you're trapped in this cabin, which feels more like some sort of campaign that's being told. Just happens that you're also, the game inside of it is playing cards. So it really does and I agree with you that the sound design is just beautiful in helping you feel like you're really there and setting the tone.
Well, and I think the sound design does what Roger Ebert said good movies do, which is make you forget about your car keys and your garage door and the meal you have to have after the movie, and you just lose yourself in it. And by the sound design doing what it does, not only are you immersed in this world, but you know there's something more than the card game. Again, in Slay the Spire, the sounds are about the thing you're watching, the battle that is taking place. There's nothing telling you there's something more to this, which goes to the point about the structure of this game, which was reflected in the genre of this game. So there are multiple circles. You start in the first circle, which is just a card game, and across the table from you is really a dungeon master, a DM, who puts on masks at different situations and pretends he's different characters and guides you through this story. He's a storyteller, and a creepy storyteller, but one who is guiding you through a journey that you get to play a part in and take action with. But anyways, there's these emerging understanding of the circles that come around. So you're playing a card game, but then you're in a room, and then you realize that the cards are talking to you, and then you realize that there's something beyond this place. And then this is where we're going to get into further spoilers. You can actually, there's the end when you die. He takes a photo of you, and you become a card. You become a death card. And you think to yourself, how many other people is every other person who has played this guy become a card? Therefore, the stoat and the stink bug, are they real things? Are they real creatures that have been captured by this camera, which we later learn, another spoiler, is actually the film inside the camera, not the camera itself. But then when you defeat Leshy, you emerge into another world. And then there's actually a real world element of this. There's a website that the YouTuber who found this game has. You can actually visit this website. There's a breadcrumb trail that people follow and find really, really interesting about this game. But what's also cool is that every one of these circles is a genre change too. As you mentioned, there's the deck builder, rougelike, but then it's an RPG. But then it's almost a visual novel, commentary on, like Doki Doki, on the world and capturing identities, but there's a mythology behind it. And, there's many reviewers who have said that this is an RPG wrapped in a deck builder, roguelike, which is wrapped in a creepy horror genre. And so there's all of these things going on, but it's laid out in such a way as you discover them, as opposed to get overwhelmed when you first start the game and just think, what game is this? Like a film, again, which seems to be doing too many things, and so you just go, I don't know what this is about, and you turn off. This kind of guides you into its multiplicity.
Yeah, it definitely tickles that sense of curiosity again. And, you need to find out what's going on in this weird world. And on top of that, it also changes art styles throughout the acts. So I don't know if you've gotten to Act 2 at all to actually see it, but it's a different game at that point completely, but different art as well. And that's actually where I kind of got stuck. Played through a little bit of Act 2, and there was a bit of me that missed the cabin, missed the atmosphere, because I am very driven by atmosphere in games. And I wonder how many other people potentially do get stuck when it swaps to a totally different feeling game. I absolutely loved the real life sort of elements of it. So there is this through line that you as the player, you're actually this character who is a YouTuber who has been sent this game to play, I believe, and can't find out anything about it. Like he's recording these videos for his audience and trying to say, does anyone know anything about this game? Like, it's kind of weird and bizarre. And so you unlock those little videos and sequences, and that's who you actually are. So you as the player are playing as this other YouTuber who is playing as the character who's as an opponent of a card game that you actually find out is part of a larger actual game that goes deeper than that. So it's very, very layered, and yet as I'm saying it and it sounds complicated, it doesn't feel complicated when you're playing. It doesn't feel overly, pretentious. I don't find, I didn't find it that way. I found it, again, quite charming and quirky, and it didn't feel like it was trying to be too smart, just it felt very pleasant overall. And it is true that I kind of got stuck at that in the end at what was a change of the type of game, but also the atmosphere. And that was a really big part of it for me, is that I really enjoyed the sounds and the feel of being in that cabin and playing those cards that way.
Yeah, I want to talk more about this game, but I also want to leave a few minutes to talk about board games. But maybe we might even have to save that for a subsequent episode, just with the time that we have. But just a connecting question then: what what is it about this game that made you want to talk about? What is it about this game that related it to board games and tabletop games? Is it just the atmosphere, or is it the sense of discovery? Is it the sense of playing with what is not actually another person, but is quite an interesting character across from you discover? What is it about this that made you choose it?
I think it was a few things. One, we were talking about Slay the Spire, and this is another deck builder on the surface when you first start. So it was already sort of related to that conversation. But you when you said you wanted to talk about board games and you said you wanted to talk about tabletop games and how different it is to play in person, that triggered me to remember about Inscryption, because it plays with your expectations of what a video game are. I think that's what it really, right? And in a different way than Doki Doki, like Doki Doki does as well, but I think it plays with a very specific, in this visual novel style. It more plays with your expectations of what that kind of game is like. Whereas I think Inscryption really messes with your mind about like what is a video game, and getting into it and seeing both the game within the game within the game that are different genres. And again, the main one, like you said, your opponent is almost a dungeon master. So there's those layers of elements, but you feel like you're playing a tabletop game and you're also playing cards. And it made me think, oh, when we're talking about how are board games different than video games, this would be an interesting game to kind of consider, because obviously it's still a single player game. So in that sense, it's not really like a board game. But I think that the Inscryption itself deals with board games and gaming, because Leshy sure loves to play games, sure loves that card game. And so that is something that's explored in Inscryption itself too, is the love of board games and card games, and playing with somebody and not being lonely, I guess, is one of the other things that it talks about.
I could totally see playing this game, you and me sitting at a table playing this game, pulling out a deck of cards that was somehow tailored to that kind of situation and battling it out and putting on different masks and trying different things and having different totems in order to give us different powers. None of it is complicated enough that it has to be a video game in the first act. And it could easily translate. And I think that seems to be deliberate, that there's this tactility to how the cards are played. I know there are games out there like this. I've never really played any of them. So Magic the Gathering comes to mind. And I know that the developers of Slay the Spire as well as Inscryption were they loved playing card games like Magic the Gathering. And there's a lot of games out there that are trying to copy this. Especially after Slay the Spire came out, there's a lot of copycat games on Steam that are trying to do the same thing, because coming up with a card game is kind of like being a DM of your own campaign with your own story, a homebrew campaign where, like, I'll make up this card, I'll do this card will do this and this and this. And so it feels like it would be easy. But this, I think what elevates Inscryption is not only the circles that come around it, and not only the tactility of the game, so you almost feel like you're actually playing it, but the story that's woven through, the cards, the stoat that is talking to you almost right from the beginning, the design elements that, again, don't just tell you that you are in a cabin, but give you a sense of the theme of what's going on, of the creepiness, the otherworldliness that is yet to be explored. Have you ever played Magic the Gathering?
Yes, I have played quite a bit. I've played in tournaments. I used to go play drafts at game stores, so I played quite a bit. I was saying around the time when I first played Dungeons and Dragons was also when I first learned to play a bit of Magic the Gathering, but it wasn't actually then that I played the majority of it. Just like with Dungeons and Dragons, that age was, I guess, more for trying things out and playing things for the first time, and only in adulthood did I actually go and play more and collect my own cards and start to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, I've played a lot, and it's a very, very deep game, like strategically a very, very deep game.
Yeah, it's something that I'd really like to try, especially in light of the last two games that we've talked about. I think to myself, God, I love card games. I'd play more card games, and especially around a table with other people. Maybe we can dig into this more in the next session, but I absolve me of my or disabuse me of my assumption about Magic the Gathering that I have to spend money to be any good. My the assumption that I've been given about this game is you collect cards and then you fight other people with your cards. But if you have crappy cards, the only way to change that is by going to buy more and spending a ton of money. I'm sure I'm wrong because of the faces that you're making, but how could I be wrong? I mean, doesn't the company want you to just buy more cards to be more powerful?
No, I mean, for sure, that is an aspect of the game. It is a collectible card game, which means that you need to collect cards and they cost money. And cards that have different viability in current meta are going to have different prices. So if you're just going after particular cards and trying to buy them, let's say on the market in that sense, you're going to be paying whatever people deem the card is worth. Otherwise, you get a pack of cards and it's always random, right? That collectible aspect. The original loot boxes, some of the original loot boxes where you didn't know what you're going to get. And just like with Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And those, you open a pack and you don't know what cards are in there. But at the same time, I will say that the hobby is really only as expensive as you want it to be. And that the reality of just playing for fun, it doesn't mean you have to spend money. Just like you said with Inscryption, where it's a simple enough game that we could have made cards and we could have made and played the game ourselves. The same is true for Magic. Lots of people put in dummy cards, so they don't have the real card that they would have wanted. They don't own it, but you could just print off a copy or put in another card and scribble "this is this card," whatever on it. And if you're just playing with friends and you're just playing for the love of the game, you can still play the game. The point of Magic, in the sense of it being expensive is that it is a competitive game. There is a competitive world of it. And if you want to win, you do need, you need a deck of those cards. You need to get a hold of that card to make that deck in some way. Whether you have a friend who's nice enough to lend you the cards that you need, that would work fine. But the point is that you wouldn't be able to enter, let's say, a tournament if you had dummy cards, if you didn't have the cards there in your deck. So in that sense, it could become more expensive if you really care about that. But in a friendly game, it doesn't matter at all, right? You can also play online, and they've done a smart thing where even online, you can purchase the virtual cards because they still want you to buy them. Otherwise, online, it could be completely free, which I believe it's still Wizards of the Coast, right? That also makes Magic. Yeah, same company as Dungeons and Dragons. So, they've been really smart with it, but there are versions that are cheaper or free, and there are ways you can play. So again, it's about limiting your rewards sort of and what kind of player you are, but it doesn't have to cost money. And one way that I played Magic the Gathering very cheaply is that you can go out to, let's say, Friday Night Magic, a very common event in that a lot of game stores will host Friday Night Magic. And usually there's a cost to enter into what is a draft, called a draft tournament. And it's like $20, maybe 25 now. I don't know if inflation has gotten to it to be anymore. But essentially that gets you the packs. So everybody in the tournament would be given 3 to 5 packs, depends what kind of version you're playing. And you would be drafting a deck in some format from these cards. That's one way a tournament can run. And so when you're paying to go play this, you're essentially paying for the cards that you're going to keep at the end, which is, I've always thought it was a really good deal because you're getting a night of entertainment as well. These events can be at least 3 hours long, usually. And you can also win. Now, if you win the tournament or get in the top 3 or 5, or it depends how many people are there that night and how many prizes they have as a result, they also use your upfront payment to fund the prize packs. So you could actually win more cards than you technically paid for. And that's how I grew my collection. I thought of it as I'm paying, I think about paying for a movie or something. I'm paying for the experience. The cards are now a bonus I can take home with me. And one thing I've done to make it fun and interesting and free later on is I've actually remixed, after years of doing this, I ended up having hundreds of cards, right? And I started mixing my own fake draft packs. with the same statistical probabilities of uncommon, common, rare cards. And then I would play with roommates and friends. We would do drafts at home. We didn't have to pay anything, just with the cards that we had, practicing those skills of deck building at the end of the day. So with the draft, it's like a deck building. You get to pick, you go around in a circle and you get to pick the cards out and build decks that way.
No, that's really cool. And I appreciate that explanation. I didn't really understand that before. And it makes a lot of sense. If you want to compete, you're going to need to spend money. It's the same for someone who plays StarCraft in competition for esports. You need a good computer, you needed a headset, you needed to fly around to go to these places. And I guess what you aren't doing is just spending more and more money on StarCraft itself. You probably only need one copy of the game, but you're doing more than enough to promote the game. And it sounds like if I just wanted to play, a basic entry fee like the Player's Handbook for Dungeons and Dragons, or the actual board game for something that costs $60 or something like that, for Ticket to Ride or Settlers of Catan. That's my entry fee, and that seems legitimate that we would pay that we would support the developer of this game. It's the addiction that I'm concerned about, because I see that becoming so contagious in the video game industry. And there's a lot of executives in the industry who essentially say, if you're not doing this, you're stupid. If you're not doing microtransactions and essentially creating a virtual currency for children to get addicted to buy certain items, then you're really wasting your time, because that's the future of making money in this industry. We're at the end of our time, Lammy, so I wanted to ask you the question I always do. One thing that we've talked about or one thing that we haven't talked about, or one thing that we've talked about that you wish we talked about more, what would that one thing be?
Well, we didn't really get to talk about board games, so next time we should maybe dive deeply into that.
Okay, well, let's do it. Next time it'll be board games, and I'm excited because last time I think I said I insist on talking about Axis and Allies. So in time between now and the next time we chat, you have to play Axis and Allies at least half a dozen times, and then we'll
All right,
be good.
so we'll talk in October.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
right. Yeah. Or maybe October 2024.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.